Hi, my name is Charlotte, and this channel is about my attempt to become moderately competent at drawing. Normally, my videos document what I've been up to each month as I attempt to learn various different subjects this year. This video, though, is a little bit of a bonus video outside of my usual content. I've watched a lot of sketchbook tours here on YouTube, and it was in fact things like sketchbook tours that convinced me that it would be really fun to learn to draw. While it's often really inspiring to see accomplished artists show page after page of beautiful finished or nearly finished art, it was also sometimes really difficult as a beginner, and even now as someone who's only just starting to build some skills, to imagine that I would ever be able to produce even the roughest and least finished of the artworks that were on show. This video is therefore intended as a little bit of a counterweight to those kind of sketchbook tours. I'm going to flip through some of the sketchbooks I produced while I was an absolute beginner and in the first year of learning to draw. I'm not expecting to wow you with my art in this. In fact, some of the sketchbooks I'm going to show you, including the sketchbook which I credit most for helping me build my skills, are as far as it is possible to be from those polished, beautiful sketchbooks that so often we see in sketchbook tours. So if you're learning to draw or thinking about learning to draw, I'm hoping this will help you understand what a more realistic idea of a sketchbook is when you're just starting out. Before I show you anything though, I have two disclaimers to make. The first is that I started really from zero. Sometimes people say, oh, I'm a beginner, but when you delve a little bit further into their story, it turns out that they were quite artistic maybe at school, and it was only life and work and jobs and college that got in the way of them continuing to use some skills they'd already developed. And I am not one of those people. I had to do art in secondary school for a few years because it was mandatory, but I think everybody was relieved when I no longer had those classes, and I walked away from them with really no skills at all and no interest in doing art. In fact, if you had told me in any of the intervening 20 plus years that one day I would be serious enough about learning art to work on it most days and start a YouTube channel to document my progress, I would have thought you were insane. So I really came to this, I have no inherent talent and I had really no skills whatsoever. My second disclaimer is that this isn't really intended as advice. I did a variety of things, and I don't really know that I made the best choices when I did those things. So I'm just showing you what I did for better or worse without really wanting to recommend any specific path for you to take. But I also think that's pretty common, especially for adult beginners, which is that we're all kind of groping around in the dark to try to figure out what it is we need to do. So here's what I did. I covered how I got started learning to draw in a little bit more detail in a couple of videos that I'll link down below, so I'm not going to go into that too much here. But let's start where I started, which is with a sketchbook that I drew along with a book I was following. That book was called You Can Learn to Draw in 30 Days by Mark Kistler, and as you can see, this sketchbook is really not personal at all. This is just a faithful reproduction of the exercises that I was being shown how to do by the book. Once I had finished that book, I bought myself a cheap little sketchbook. This cost me a pound or so, less than $2. And because I really didn't know how to draw anything, I just redrew the things that I had learned in that Mark Kistler book. And I think this is also really typical of beginners. You really don't know how to draw very many things, so you just repeat the few things that you do know how to draw. So I think a lot of beginner sketchbooks are a lot of the same thing over and over as you try to cement some initial skills. The next thing I did was work through the Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain workbook by Betty Edwards. And again, this is a very impersonal sort of set of work. I was really just following instructions again. But I did learn a lot from this, and it got me started trying to draw portraits, which is something that I'm still trying to learn to do even today. Then there's a big gap, and there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that in the period from the beginning of 2016, when I did that Betty Edwards workbook, and August 2020, which is when I started to take learning to draw a bit more seriously, I would only have very sporadic interest in learning to draw. I would tend to pick it up as a hobby for a couple of weeks, a month maybe at most. I would fill a small, inexpensive sketchbook, and then something would happen, I'd get distracted or busy, and I just wouldn't go back to it when my schedule went back to normal. The second reason that I have a bit of a gap is that I had a bit of a water issue and I accidentally flooded a box that contained some journals and some small completed sketchbooks. They weren't really worth salvaging, so I ended up recycling the sketchbooks, and I don't think that's any great loss to the art world. The only thing that remains of this period is this small sketchbook that I worked on in the summer of 2017, and as you can see, I'm just kind of returning to a certain set of subjects, mostly profile portraits, and one or two things like buildings, which become another topic that I get interested in drawing later. So then we get to August 2020, and I think like many people, I realized at that point in that year that things were going to be tough, I was going to be home a lot, and I really needed a hobby to take my mind off what was going on in the world outside. So I decided to take drawing a bit more seriously, and at this point, I chose to follow the Drawbox program. Now, if you're familiar with Drawbox, you'll know that one of the precepts of the program is that because the material covered in that drawing course is quite dry and technical, and people are prone to kind of burning out on it if they spend too much time on it, you're supposed to spend no more than 50% of your time working on Drawbox and 50% of your time drawing for pleasure. So at this point, my sketchbooks and my general kind of mass of drawings that I did split into two parts. I have all of my notes and these kind of impersonal exercises on the one side, and on the other I have a set of sketchbooks that I started to do as I started to draw for pleasure. The problem that I think many, if not all beginners have, is that when you don't really know how to draw, it's really difficult to figure out what you should be trying to draw. And a video that does the rounds a lot in the Drawbox community is one called Sketching 101. It's a video on a YouTube channel that belongs to the head of a Singapore art school called FZD. And in that video, he talks about what absolute beginners should try to draw for like the most success and enjoyment. And he recommends that you choose subjects where you could get 90% of the details of the reference wrong, but it will still recognizably be a thing. So for example, he suggests absolute beginners should start with things from the natural world, organic objects like trees and rocks, where even if you can't copy the reference very closely, whatever you produce will probably still look like a rock or look like a tree. He suggests avoiding things like faces, people, familiar animals like dogs, and highly engineered objects like cars, because the reality is if you get even some very small details wrong, that will be really obvious to even the most untrained eye, and you will probably be very dissatisfied with your work. Since I was already pretty interested in drawing the natural world, I dove straight into this. And so here I have several pages of drawing rocks and rock formations, which I actually really enjoyed doing, and then an entire sketchbook full of drawings of trees, ranging from highly stylized to much more realistic, trees drawn from reference and trees drawn from imagination. I'm not sure I completely agree with everything in that Sketching 101 video, but I do think it hits on something quite important, which is it's really good when you're a beginner to have some successes. It may not look like the tree in the reference, but it does still look like a tree. And the reason I'm saying this is because as a novice artist, one of the pieces of advice you get given a lot is, focus on the process. Don't worry about the outcomes, because very likely all your outcomes in the first year, 2 years, whatever, are going to be far below what you can see in your mind and are probably going to be objectively bad. And I think that's a great theory, and I do think it's really helpful to focus heavily on the process and not the outcomes. But I also don't think that's a particularly human way to behave. I think that if you continually produce really bad art that looks nothing like the reference or what you had in your mind, it can get kind of depressing and you're quite likely to burn out. So picking easy subjects where it still looks like a tree, maybe not the tree in the photo, but a tree nevertheless, and even a nice tree, a tree where you feel like it's a good drawing, is a good experience to have early on and is likely to help you keep going. Another thing that I did in this period was fill this sketchbook with little drawings of houses. And I did this solely because I enjoy drawing little houses, and I found a whole bunch of images that I liked on Pinterest of interesting looking buildings. So this was a pure pleasure project. Again, there's really nothing in here that's objectively particularly good, but it was a lot of fun to do this sketchbook and I was really happy with it when I finished. You'll have noticed that all of my sketchbooks so far have been these really small, really cheap things. And for me, that made a lot of sense. I really didn't have a lot of fear of the blank page or worry about wasting good paper or a good sketchbook or drawing something that wasn't worthy of the sketchbook when it only represented an investment of £1, a couple of dollars. That said, the next sketchbook I'm going to show you is a very different thing in every way. This is the most useful sketchbook that I completed in my first year of learning to draw. I called it my giant junk sketchbook. It is an A4 sketchbook with 100 sheets or 200 pages inside. Don't worry, I'm not going to flip through all of it, mostly because you would be fast asleep before I got 20 pages in. That's because in addition to being the most useful sketchbook I had, this was the sketchbook I never intended to show anybody. It was a 100-day project that I took on in early 2021. I didn't actually work on it on 100 consecutive days. I think if you include my days off, it actually took closer to 150 days to finish. In total, I spent somewhere between 200 and 300 hours drawing in this sketchbook, and my goal was to fill every centimeter of every page, doing 2 pages per day that I worked on it. So what's in it? Pages and pages and pages of pure pencil mileage. I would take note of any fundamental basic exercise that I was finding in any way difficult, and I would just run those exercises over and over until I felt like I was very confident and had mastered the basics of them. And the great thing was, it actually worked. So here on the very first day, I was drawing simple volumes. I was drawing organic shapes with cross contours, which is a draw box exercise. I was struggling to draw little scenes of multiple organic objects as if they were interacting and touching one another. By just a few days later, I had written at the bottom of a page, "This is a breakthrough." This was a point at where I suddenly understood how to draw things so that they looked like they were interacting, which is something I just really couldn't wrap my brain around the first time I encountered it. So over the course of these many pages, I did things like take simple 3D forms and rotate them around in my imagination. My favorite thing to draw this with was pears for some reason. I drew a lot of cylinders, a fundamental shape that I had always struggled with. So I started off drawing them pretty badly, and I got better. And then I started to draw more complicated cylinders with cutouts and add-ons. And then I started to draw them tapering and turning. And then I used those skills that I'd learned in order to draw animal horns for deer and goats. And I also had fun in this sketchbook. I was playing around with ovoid shapes one day and ended up creating this little robot. And this little character then pops up all over the place for the next few months because I really liked him and I wanted to keep playing with this little character that I'd created. So this was a really ugly, really time-consuming sketchbook. It is painfully unlike the gorgeous sketchbooks that I admire so much on sketchbook tours I see here on YouTube. I can imagine there are a lot of people who are kind of at that level that I was at when I started this project, who are thinking like, I don't want to spend 200, 300 hours grinding my way through these basic exercises. And I really have 3 responses to that. The first is that I actually genuinely enjoyed this. I tended to work on this while I also had a television program on in the background, or I was listening to a podcast. So it wasn't something that needed every single iota of my attention to draw. And then I also genuinely enjoy getting better at something that I find difficult. The second thing is, of course, this was a very personal set of exercises that I chose. And there's a very good chance that you don't have any of the same weaknesses as me, and that perhaps you can get to where I got to at the end of 100 days in a much shorter period of time. You know, I'm not claiming to be good at this. I'm not claiming to be the fastest learner of these skills. My third reason that I didn't find this problematic was that I can imagine wanting to make art a part of my life for the next 20 or 30 years. I'm 47 now. There's no reason I couldn't still be drawing regularly when I'm in my 70s. In that context, spending that time, even a few hundred hours of time, is really a drop in the ocean compared to the length of time I anticipate continuing to draw and continuing to build skills. So I just don't worry about it. I just think it's a stepping stone. It was a little speed bump towards getting better, and that's all. So that's my ugly junk sketchbook. I never intended to show this to anybody, but here we are. I do continue to have one of these, which I also plan not to ever show to anybody, but just to know this is something that I continue to do in the background anytime I encounter a drawing skill where I think pure repetition will really help me here. I finished one more sketchbook in what I consider to be my absolute beginner phase, and it's another of these inexpensive little paper covered sketchbooks. This is the first one where I covered a bunch of different subjects within a single sketchbook. So on the first few pages, I have some inking practice, some monsters, a hair tutorial, but then I get into Inktober 2021. So remember my little robot character? I made up a silly little story for each prompt of Inktober 21 for my little robot and his friends who are living on a deserted planet. I gave myself like 10 to 15 minutes to draw these every day, so the art is very simplistic and honestly kind of cringe-making at this point. So I'm not, again, expecting anybody to be impressed by this, but I did really enjoy it. I really enjoyed making my little character. I really enjoyed telling his little story. And so I don't hate this. I think this is a fun thing that I have in my sketchbook. And I think, again, for beginners, it's nice to have these little reminders of things that you did enjoy, even if you look at the art and think, wow, what was I thinking? After Inktober was done, I finished up this sketchbook by doing a lot of drawings of draped cloth and folded cloth. Two of my favorite drawings from 2021 are in this set. You can see me starting really from scratch, and then by the end I did this rail of folded scarves and also this gray-toned study of a diaper fold. And I was really happy with these. And like I said, they're still some of my favorite things that I did in 2021. When I finished this sketchbook, it was mid-December, and I felt at that time that it was probably right to kind of graduate up to a larger and more robust sketchbook. And at this point, I would say I stopped being an absolute beginner. The category I most often think of myself as being in is kind of advanced beginner. I have some skills, but I'm not really very good at anything. I don't do a lot of finished pieces, and I would really hesitate to call myself an intermediate level artist. So that's my realistic tour of the first few sketchbooks that I put together, complete with really ugly drawings, endless pencil mileage, and little cute robots. If you'd like to hear more about where I'm up to now with learning to draw, then I post a video every weekend about that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about what beginners should do in their sketchbooks, what you did, what really worked for you. I'll also probably do a quick flip through of that first blue sketchbook in the next few weeks if you're interested in that. So for now, I hope you have a great creative week, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.